What are competencies? Now, in the UK anyway, we have a sort of relatively unique perspective on this concept, and we discuss it in a way which we all in the industry sort of understand but rarely specify. In the general sense, it's just an area of competence. But that doesn't really work, particularly in the context of a competency framework, which is typically how organisations, at least in the UK, think about these things. In this context, competencies are sort of behavioural characteristics which are underpinning performance in the role, and indeed perhaps throughout the entire organisation, and perhaps at different levels of seniority. So, for example, an organisation might have a competency framework that includes integrity and ethics, that includes work ethic, that includes commercial awareness. Just key things that we think, based on introspection and based on research and based on speaking with the organisation, that everyone thinks is important to the role and to performance and retention and fit into that role. Now, the key thing is that they're almost always inherently, like I said, behavioural, as opposed to knowledge and skills and more hard, more practical, tangible skills. It's more about those behaviours. And they do tend to differ. Different organisations, different organisational cultures tend to focus on different competencies, and some things can be more broadly applicable elsewhere, and some things are very specific to the needs of this particular organisation and its aims. But they tend to be behavioural, and as a result you measure them in a very specific way, and organisations almost always get this wrong. Now, what will typically happen is they will outline a competency framework, sometimes to quite great expense. Sometimes they'll involve consultancies, or they'll just spend a great deal of time and effort and energy identifying a competency framework and building literature around it, the indicators, the levels, and so on. And then what do they do in the end? Well, they think, oh, we'll just ask questions in an interview, as if interviews were able to measure those kinds of constructs. And it's really difficult to see, because interviews are an extremely ineffective tool to measure behavioural competencies. Extremely ineffective. Interviews are fundamentally social skills tests. They just see how charismatic you are. Just how well can you answer questions verbally. And that's not to say that doesn't matter, because it does. Those are really useful tools for that reason. Any organisation is a group of people, and being able to navigate interpersonal domain is key. But if you were looking at integrity and ethics, if you were looking at resilience, if you're looking at work ethic, industriousness, organisational skills, these things correlate zero with an interview. Because a candidate who is charismatic and has social skills will convince you that they are resilient and organised and have work ethic. Even if they have none of those things, they will convince you, because that is the test. That is how it works. And that's important to remember. And it's also important to remember that that same candidate that convinced you of all of those things, if for some reason your competency framework was the opposite, and you wanted people who were lazy and not resilient and disorganised, they could convince you just as well that they were all of those things. There's no association there whatsoever with levels of those competencies in interview performance. So what do? Well, they are behavioural constructs, and so you will need a behavioural assessment in order to measure them. Personality questionnaires, for example. Those assessments are designed specifically to measure behavioural constructs, and that is all competencies are. And so by using assessments which actually look at the specific traits which underpin these competencies, you can form a real picture of their overall competency potential and see how well they will behave in the role, in the organisation, and thus their level of overall fit to your requirements.